Mike Brown, the former FEMA director.
Joining us here is the former FEMA director.
History, I think, was very unkind to you, my friend. Very unkind.
Mr. Brown, thanks for being with us.
This is Michael Brown Unplugged.
Hey, welcome to this episode of Michael Brown Unplugged. So when was this email? This was on Monday, November 4. I get an email from Privacy Governance at iHeartMedia. It's apparently from the Chief Privacy Officer, and it says, iHeartMedia team, effective January 1, 2020, a law will go into effect aimed at strengthening consumer privacy rights and protections for California residents. Under this regulation, the California Consumer Privacy Act of 2018, the CCPA, consumers residing in California will have the legal right to, 1, know the details of any of their personal information, which is being collected, sold, or disclosed by iHeartMedia. 2, access that information. 3, request deletion by iHeartMedia of that information. And 4, request that iHeartMedia stop selling that information. And then the email goes on to say that the CCPA applies to all individuals and legal entities doing business in California, including iHeartMedia. The changes include 1, and there's a list of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's six things that it does. Expands the definition of personal information, which we'll get to in a minute. Increases transparency and access to personal information by consumers via the right to know how their information is managed. 3, updates requirements for collecting minors' personal information. 4, introduces efforts to ensure organizations do not discriminate by denying goods or service, etc. Typical non-discrimination clause. Let's see, this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Enhancing training for employees responsible for complying with the CCPA. That probably means I'm going to have to take some test somewhere. And last but not least, increasing organizations' responsibility to ensure security of personal information and imposing a duty to implement and maintain reasonable security procedures and practices. And then the Chief Privacy Officer goes on to talk about how they're going to start implementing ways to, or start looking and devising ways to implement the California Act, which my guess is, because iHeartMedia obviously does business not just in California but around the country, and there's really no way to control, for example, someone listening to an iHeart podcast in California, or someone, for example, on the radio program, you can text the word Mike to 57739. Well, if you do that from California, then this act is going to apply. What this led me to realize, though, is that as consumers, I guess I'm just ignorant, but I didn't realize that we all have secret scores, almost like social scores that they have in China. Hidden ratings that determine how we might wait on hold when calling a business, whether we can return an item at a store, what type of service we're going to receive, and a low score sends you to the back of the bus. And high scores, well, you get to go to the front of the bus. You get the elite treatment. Now, every once in a while, a journalist will lament the inaccessibility of these kinds of systems because they're largely invisible to the public. Back in 2012, the New York Times wrote that most people have no inkling that they even exist. And then in 2018, the Wall Street Journal said exactly the same thing. Most recently, in April, the journal's Christopher Mims looked at a company called SIFT, S-I-F-T. They have a proprietary scoring system that tracks, are you ready for this? They track 16,000 factors for companies like Airbnb and something called OkCupid. I'm scared to look up OkCupid because who knows what I'll start getting emails from. The Wall Street Journal says SIFT, this data mining company, SIFT judges whether or not you can be trusted. Yet there's no file with your name on it that can be produced upon request. So SIFT is checking on everything that I do, collecting all of this data, tracking 16,000 factors from all of these different companies, yet turns out SIFT does have a file on you. And I only know that because a reporter for the New York Times, I know, don't kill the messenger. I think this is actually a good story. This woman from the New York Times, woman, I'm not sure it's a woman. First name is Kashmir. So I don't know, male or female. this individual, this reporter, let's just say the reporter, started contacting SIFT demanding that they produce the file that they had on her. Well, after a lot of going back and forth, she finally got the file, and it was more than, are you ready for this? It was more than 400 pages long. And here's the disturbing part to me. She says it contained all of the messages that she had ever sent to a host on Airbnb. It had years of her delivery orders that she had made through Yelp. It had a log of every time the reporter had opened the Coinbase app on the reporter's iPhone. And it included in detailed information about the device that the reporter was using to do those things, including the IP address from which the reporter was working. So when she, in the story that this reporter writes, I keep saying she, I don't know. She says that I used my iPhone to order chicken tikka masala, vegetable samosas, and garlic naan on a Saturday night in April 3 years ago. SIFT knew that she had used her Apple laptop to sign into Coinbase in January of 17 to change her password. SIFT knew about a nightmare Thanksgiving she had in California's wine country because it captured all the messages between her and the host of an Airbnb that she had rented. She was complaining about a heater in the room with a big couch. It had been running. They couldn't figure out how to turn it off. The air was musty and dirty, and she was going back and forth with this Airbnb person. SIFT knew about all of those messages. I know I'm getting way too riled up about this because I'm going to start digging. I'm going to contact SIFT and see what they have on me. Now, this may seem comical to some people, but the companies that are gathering and paying for this data find it valuable. What would you think they find it valuable for? Well, in her story, she claims that the companies use it to root out fraud and increase the revenue they can collect from people that happen to be big spenders. SIFT has this data because the company has been hired by companies like Airbnb, Yelp, and Coinbase to do things like identify stolen credit cards, help spot identity thieves, and abusive behavior. But the fact that obscure companies are accumulating information about years of yours and mine online and even offline behavior ought to be disturbing at the least. Now, there are a lot of companies that do business scoring consumers. The challenge is, how do you identify them? Who are they? And once you find out who the companies are, how do you get the data that they have about you? Well, in the story, she lists She lists 5 different companies. Listen to these companies because I'm not going to be able to do it right away, but I'm going to at some point go through and see what I can find about each of these companies and what they have on me. SIFT, that determines consumer trustworthiness. Oh. And so when I walk into a retail outlet, how do they know I'm there? How do they know what SIFT has on me? Well, you can find out by emailing privacy@sift.com. Then there's a company called Zeta, Z-E-T-A, kind of like the cartel, the Zeta cartel. Zeta Global, Z-E-T-A Global. They identify people with a lot of money to spend, and they do have an online form that you can get your data from them. Then there's a company called Retail Equation. Now, they help companies like Best Buy and Sephora. I think Sephora is the makeup company, right? You women tell me, I don't know. Here's what Retail Equation does. They help companies determine whether or not to accept or reject a product return. Well, no, wait a minute. The product return should be based upon the return policy that's on that. You know, when you get your slip after you buy something and you get, nowadays you get a receipt that is about 6 feet long. And down there on the bottom somewhere is the return policy. Well, in my opinion, as a lawyer, that's the contract language. That's the language that says, here are the terms upon which you can or cannot return a product. You know, so many numbers of days, has to be in original packaging. You can't have, done anything to damage it, blah, 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 blah. Well, this company, Retail Equation, helps companies decide whether or not to accept or reject a product return. Now, you can find out about your return activity by emailing returnactivityreport@theretailequation.com. returnactivityreport@theretailequation.com. Then there's another company, Riskified, Riskified. Riskified apparently helps develop fraud scores. You thought you just had a credit score. We got credit scores, we got social scores, and now we got fraud scores. That's going to tell companies what data they have on your possible crookedness. What crookedness? Criminal records? I don't know. Apparently, you can find out from them by contacting privacy@riskified.com. Privacy@riskified.com. And then there's this last one called Customer, but spelled with a K. Kustomer. It is a database company that provides what it calls, are you ready for this? Quote, unprecedented insight into a customer's past experiences and current sentiment. What the hell is that? Unprecedented insight into my past experiences and what my current sentiment is? You know, my current sentiment right now is kind of be pissed off. Who the hell's Customer? And what do you have on me? I'm going to try to find out. Privacy@Customer with a K, privacy@customer.com. Now, the bottom line on this is, according to the story I'm reading, is you can email all of these people, but there's no guarantee you're going to get the data. When the reporter tried to get the data from Customer, the reporter got the runaround. And instead of getting the data, they said, well, we're revising our policies and we're revising our procedures, and she still doesn't have it. But why? What's all of this about? Let's go back to that email that I read from our chief privacy officer about the California Consumer Privacy Act of 2018. Here's the kicker. Most of the companies started honoring these requests only because of the California Consumer Privacy Act. It goes into effect next year, 2020, and it will give Californians the right to see what data a company holds on them. Now, this follows, you may have heard me talk a couple of podcasts ago about the General Data Protection Regulation in the European Union. That law lets Europeans gain access to and even delete all of their online data. So some companies, as I mentioned in that podcast, have decided to honor the EU transparency requirements, even for those of us who fortunately don't live in the EU or fortunately don't live in the Golden State of California. According to Jason Tan, the CEO of SIFT, we expect these are the first of many laws. Now, he founded this company, or I should say the company was founded back in 2011, and they claim that they started making the files available to all end users this past June, even though they weren't required to do so legally. You and I would be an end user. He says that they're trying to be more privacy conscious, that we want to be good citizens and stewards of the internet, including transparency. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm going to chase down my data files. There's a June report from the Consumer Education Foundation. They want the Federal Trade Commission to investigate secret surveillance scores that are, quote, generated by a shadowy group of privacy-busting firms that operate in the dark recesses of the American marketplace. That report, sitting here looking at it right now, they named 11 firms, 11 different companies that rate you as a shopper, as a potential renter, and as a prospective employee. I'm going to chase them all down just for the fun of it. Because when I found out, you know how I feel about the Chinese social scores. It really bugs me. Well, this is almost the equivalent of a social score, except that it's not being done by the government. It's being done by a private enterprise. Now, according to this reporter, the reporter's SIFT file did not come with a credit score type number at the top, but instead a lot of entries included a percentage rating as to whether this reporter's behavior was abuse, not abuse, normal, fraudulent, account takeover, or not account takeover. Now, the reporter does kind of a sloppy job here. I'm not sure what any of those mean. But in fairness to the reporter, I'm not sure the reporter knows what any of those mean. So going back to the CEO of SIFT, he says that we are in the business of predicting risks for particular events at particular times for particular fraud. Well, could he be more particular? How many more particulars can he put in that sentence? He says, behind the scenes, we're trying to create connections between fraudulent accounts. So to score risk, the more data that SIFT has, he claims the better they can detect fraud. He claims, though, they're not looking at the data, that it's just machines and algorithms doing the work. He says, quote, but it's incredible what machines can do when they can look under every stone. I almost blew off the email from our chief privacy officer until he mentioned the California Act, and I started doing some digging. When this reporter asked Mr. Tan, the CEO of SIFT, how many people had requested their data since the company introduced the option to get it, he says, yeah, we didn't get much of a response. I'm not surprised by that, because I think most people just don't give a rat's ass about their privacy. Well, I have nothing to hide. You may have nothing to hide, but it may prevent you from returning something to Best Buy. It may prevent you from renting something on Airbnb. I used Uber the other day. You know, I have an Uber score as a rider. As a passenger, I have a score. I'm rating the driver at the same time that the driver's rating me. I think I have a 4.8 or 4.9 out of a possible 5. I don't think anybody ever gets a 5, but who knows? Maybe I'll try. The Zeta Global Company, a spokesperson for them said that they've created a portal for data requests in August and that 10 people have requested their data so far. You know, that's probably because nobody has any clue that these companies even exist. So every time you hear about a social score in China, just be aware that, well, there are a lot of scores besides your FICO score or whatever kind of score you might be thinking that you have. Think about those companies. Let me just remind you what they all are. SIFT, S-I-F-T, Zeta, Zeta Global, Retail Equation, Riskified, and Customer with a K. Yeah, spell it with a K because now that makes you cool. Check your data. I'm going to check mine, and I'll let you know what I find out. Thanks for listening to this edition of Michael Brown Unplugged. I'll talk to you tomorrow.